A single signature, just one stroke of the pen, and he thought he was finally free. But when he flipped to the last page, his world collapsed in an instant. A powerful billionaire CEO, a woman he thought he had discarded, and a final message that shattered him to his core. What was written in those final words? And why did it bring the cold-hearted billionaire to his knees? Stay with me until the very end, because this story will change the way you see love, loss, and regret forever. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's get started. The boardroom was silent, suffocating in its stillness. The air held the weight of unspoken words, of years unraveled in a single moment. A clock on the far wall ticked methodically, indifferent to the silent battle playing out between two people who had once vowed forever. Across the long mahogany table sat Adrian Blackwood, billionaire, empire builder, a man who had turned ambition into an art form. His posture was relaxed, almost dismissive, but the tight grip of his fingers on the armrest betrayed a different story. He was a man who had always controlled every outcome, every deal, every situation. And now, he was about to close the final chapter of a marriage that had become nothing more than a contract to dissolve. Claire sat opposite him, her figure poised, but unnervingly still. If she felt anything at all, she gave no indication. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and devotion, now held a quiet resignation. No fire, no fight, just the hollow acceptance of a woman who had long since stopped expecting a miracle. Adrian barely spared her a glance. "Sign it, and we're done." The words were clipped, as emotionless as the man who spoke them. They carried the finality of a gavel strike, the echo of a door closing forever. For the briefest moment, Claire hesitated. A ghost of something flickered in her gaze, something fragile and painful. But then, just as quickly it was gone. Her fingers curled around the pen, their tremble so slight, it was almost imperceptible. Almost. She lowered the pen to paper, the ink flowing seamlessly across the pristine white, as she wrote the name that once meant everything to her. Claire Blackwood. A name that, in seconds, would no longer belong to her. The weight of finality pressed down on her chest, suffocating in its quiet devastation. And yet, she didn't waver, didn't let him see the storm raging beneath her surface. She had shed too many tears in private to let a single one fall in front of him. Not now. Not when the last shred of her dignity was all she had left. The moment her signature was complete, she laid the pen down with deliberate precision. A slow, final exhale left her lips. She slid the papers forward, the sound whispering through the empty room like the last breath of a dying love. Then, she spoke, her voice steady but laced with something unreadable. "Congratulations, Mr. Blackwood." The use of his last name was deliberate, a scalpel-sharp incision meant to sever the last thread that tied them together. She stood, smoothing the fabric of her blouse, as if brushing away invisible remnants of the past. No dramatic exit, no parting words dripping with regret. Just quiet, unshaken composure. Adrian said nothing, didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the moment for what it was. It was over, or so he thought. To Adrian Blackwood, Claire was a chapter long closed, a story he had written, lived, and discarded. She had been too soft, too emotional, too naive to understand the world he lived in, a world that demanded ruthlessness, not sentiment. She had once tried to keep up, tried to exist in the storm of his ambition. But in the end, she had crumbled, just as he had expected. Weak. That was the word he had once assigned to her. He had convinced himself that letting go was easy, that there was nothing left to feel. And yet, as she walked out of that boardroom, her heels clicking against the cold marble, something unexpected slithered through the cracks of his perfectly constructed armor. A sensation so foreign, it made his pulse stutter. Doubt. It was absurd. He had done what needed to be done. He had tied up the last loose end. And yet, why did his throat feel tight? Why did the sight of her back, retreating from his life, unsettle him in a way he couldn't name? Shaking off the ridiculous thought, he reached for the stack of papers, his movements sharp, almost irritated. He wanted this over. Done. His fingers flipped through the pages with practiced indifference, until they reached the last one. Then, everything stopped. His breath hitched. His fingers stiffened around the paper's edge. His pulse, once steady and unshaken, faltered. At first, his mind refused to comprehend what he was seeing. The words blurred, twisted, rearranged themselves in ways that made no sense. And then it hit him. The meaning, the weight, the undeniable truth of it all. His hands trembled. The blood drained from his face. His stomach twisted into something sharp, something cruel. The words before him, they were never supposed to exist. They were never meant to be real. Adrian Blackwood, the unshakable, ruthless billionaire, had faced down competitors, crushed opponents, built empires with nothing more than sheer willpower. But this shattered him. A cold sweat broke across his skin. His body, so accustomed to power, to control, to dominance, suddenly felt weightless, unmoored. And then, in a moment so foreign, so unlike him, he lost all strength in his legs. The chair screeched back. His knees hit the floor, because in his hands on that last page was a truth so devastating, so irreversible, that for the first time in his life, Adrian Blackwood had no idea what to do next. The boardroom was empty now, silent, except for the sound of Adrian Blackwood's shallow, uneven breaths. His hands trembled as he gripped the divorce papers, his knuckles turning white. The world around him had blurred into insignificance. The towering windows, the city skyline stretching beyond them, the empire he had built with ruthless precision. None of it mattered in that moment, because the words in front of him weren't legal jargon. They weren't negotiations over assets, stock holdings, or settlements. They weren't demands for more. They were a letter from Claire. His vision swam as he read the first line. Adrian, if you're reading this, then we are no longer husband and wife. But I need you to know something before we truly part ways. His chest tightened. A strange sensation pressed against his ribcage, unfamiliar, yet agonizing. His pulse pounded against his temples, an erratic rhythm that made it hard to breathe. Why did her words feel heavier than they should? Why did they carve through the layers of his indifference, slicing straight into the spaces he thought were long dead? His fingers clenched the letter. He read on. I never wanted your money. I never wanted your empire. I wanted you. Adrian's jaw locked. His heartbeat roared in his ears. The man you were before power consumed you. The man who held my hand at midnight and swore the world couldn't touch us. The man who once looked at me like I was enough. The paper quivered in his grip. But I know now. That man is gone. A hollow pit formed in his stomach. His throat burned. Had she always seen it? The shift? The slow, methodical erosion of the man she once loved? Had she known, long before he was willing to admit, that he had traded something irreplaceable for a kingdom built on steel and glass? His eyes stung, but he refused to blink, refused to acknowledge the unbearable weight pressing against his chest. So this is my final gift to you, Adrian. His breath hitched. The truth. He frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. His gaze dropped lower, and then he saw it. His entire body went rigid. There, beneath her words stapled to the page, an ultrasound picture. Adrian stopped breathing. For a moment, time itself seemed to collapse in on him. The air grew dense, suffocating. His lungs refused to expand, his hands numbed, and his mind, his sharp, calculating mind, could not process what he was seeing. A grainy black and white image. Small, delicate, unformed, yet unmistakable. His child. His vision blurred. His fingers trembled as he lifted the paper closer, as if proximity would make the truth less devastating. Claire was pregnant, and she never told him. A choked sound left his throat, half gasp, half curse, as the realization crashed down like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was a reckoning. Adrian Blackwood, the unshakable billionaire, the man who controlled every aspect of his world with ruthless precision, had just lost the one thing he never even knew he had. His knees buckled. The chair behind him scraped against the floor as he stumbled back, his body giving out beneath the weight of the revelation. His empire, his wealth, his power, none of it meant anything in that moment, because the only thing that mattered was already walking away from him. And for the first time in his life, Adrian Blackwood had no idea how to fix it. Adrian's vision blurred. The ultrasound picture trembled between his fingers, his grip tightening, as if crushing it might somehow make the truth disappear. But it wouldn't. It was real. A child. His child. A shuddering breath left his lips. The weight of those two words wrapped around his throat like a vice, suffocating, inescapable. No, this isn't possible. His voice was barely a whisper, cracked and unfamiliar. But the denial in his words held no power against the undeniable proof in front of him. His empire, his meticulously built kingdom of wealth and power, felt like nothing now, reduced to dust beneath the crushing reality that had just unraveled before him. Claire hadn't just left him. She had left to protect the life growing inside her. And he had never even noticed. A sickening wave of nausea curled in his stomach. How? How had he been so blind? His mind clawed through the past, searching, desperate, for signs he had missed. The quiet moments when she had hesitated, the way she had reached for him in the darkness, but never spoke a word. The exhaustion in her eyes, the way she had lingered before walking out of a room, as if silently begging him to just see her. But he hadn't. He never did. He had been too consumed by numbers, by board meetings and billion-dollar deals. Too obsessed with control, with power, with winning. And in his obsession, he had lost everything. Adrian staggered back, his legs barely holding him up. The world around him, his office, the towering windows, the gleaming city skyline beyond, blurred into insignificance. None of it mattered. Not the fortune he had amassed, not the empire he had conquered, not the name that held weight in every corner of the corporate world. What did any of it mean if, at the end of the day, he was utterly alone? A raw, hollow ache pulsed through his chest. Claire was gone, and she had taken the only piece of him that ever truly mattered. His child, their child. His breaths came in sharp, uneven gasps, panic creeping into the spaces where arrogance and certainty once lived. He had spent years building an empire that no one could take from him. Yet now, he was realizing the bitter truth. The most important thing in his life had walked away without a fight, because she had already lost hope in him, because she no longer believed he was capable of love. Adrian squeezed his eyes shut, but the darkness behind his lids only made it worse. He could see her, Claire, the way she had looked at him across the boardroom table, composed, distant, unshaken, as if he were nothing more than a stranger. She had already mourned him. She had already made peace with a life without him. And he never saw it coming. His pulse pounded. A desperate, clawing panic settled deep in his gut, screaming at him that this wasn't over. It couldn't be. There had to be a way to fix this. There had to be a way to bring her back. Because for the first time in his life, Adrian Blackwood, the man who had everything, was faced with the terrifying realization that he might have just lost the one thing he could never get back. Adrian Blackwood had never felt powerless before. Not when he crushed his competition. Not when he made ruthless business deals that turned billionaires into beggars overnight. Not when he walked into any room and commanded respect without uttering a single word. But now, he felt it. It clawed at him, cold and merciless. Because for the first time in his life, there was no deal to make. No contract to negotiate. No power move to execute. Claire was gone, and she had left without a trace. Adrian stormed out of his office, his heart hammering in his chest. He barely registered the startled expressions of his employees, the way conversations halted mid-sentence, the way heads turned as he moved past them like a man possessed. A voice called out behind him, "Mr. Blackwood? Sir, where are you?" His assistant, Olivia, loyal, efficient, utterly useless to him right now. He didn't answer. His phone was already in his hand. His fingers, usually so steady, so sure, trembled as he scrolled through his contacts. Claire. He pressed the call button. Ring. His pulse pounded. Ring. His stomach twisted. Ring. We're sorry. The number you have dialed is no longer in service. No. No. He lowered the phone, staring at the screen as if he could will it to work. As if this were some kind of mistake. Disconnected. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. He called again. Same response. Again. Same. Claire had cut him off. Completely. A wave of something dark and suffocating coiled around his chest. Something he refused to name, because naming it would make it real. This wasn't happening. He wouldn't let it happen. His driver was already scrambling to open the car door by the time Adrian stepped onto the curb. Weeks passed, and with them, everything Adrian Blackwood thought he was began to unravel. Regret didn't just settle in his chest. It consumed him. It gnawed at his mind during the long, sleepless nights. It clawed at his gut when he sat in his cold, empty penthouse, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey in his hand, knowing no amount of liquor could drown out what he had done. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that emotions were for the weak, that love was nothing more than a liability, a distraction from the ruthless game of power and control. But now he understood the cruelest irony of it all. He had built an empire to be remembered, but the only person who truly mattered had made herself impossible to find. Then one morning a single envelope arrived on his desk, a final legal notice. The weight of it was insignificant, yet as he held it in his hands, his heart pounded like it was holding a bomb. Then he saw it, a return address, a town by the sea, remote, unassuming, a place he never would have looked. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The wind howled as Adrian stepped out of the car. The sea stretched endlessly before him, waves crashing against the rocky shore, the scent of salt and rain thick in the air. His breath was uneven. He hadn't run, but his chest burned as if he had. His pulse pounded in his ears as he climbed the wooden steps of the quiet house in front of him. The door opened before he even had a chance to knock. And there, standing in the doorway, was not Claire. It was Sophia. Her gaze met his, sharp and knowing. She had always been one of Claire's closest friends, protective, unshakable. And now, she stood before him, her hand resting over her growing belly, her posture guarded, but not unkind. Adrian tried to speak, but for the first time in his life, words failed him. Sophia didn't need to ask why he was there. She already knew. Her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes, those weren't cold. They weren't cruel. They were pitying. That was worse. Much worse. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to work. Where is she? Silence. A moment stretched between them, thick with 1,000 unspoken words. Sophia's hand moved to the curve of her belly, almost absent-mindedly, and his throat tightened at the unspoken reminder. Claire could be standing here just like this, carrying his child, if he hadn't been so blind. But she wasn't here, and maybe she never would be. Sophia sighed, her gaze flickering to the sky, as if debating something. Then, finally, she looked back at him. She doesn't want to be found. The words gutted him. He didn't flinch, didn't react. But deep inside, something broke. Adrian had spent his entire life believing that everything had a price, that anything lost could be regained, if only he was willing to pay enough. But what if Claire was the one thing that didn't have a price? What if she was the one thing he couldn't win back? He let out a slow, shaky breath. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Please. Sophia's expression softened, but she shook her head. And then, without another word, she stepped back, closing the door. Adrian stood there, motionless, staring at the wood in front of him, as if he could will it to open again. But it didn't. The wind howled. The sea raged. And for the first time in years, Adrian Blackwood felt something more powerful than anger. Despair. But despair would not win. Because if Claire didn't want to be found, then he would search until he earned the right to find her. And so, his journey began. A new story. A new chase. Not for power. Not for wealth. But for something infinitely more valuable. The woman he let slip through his fingers. And the child he never knew he had. Should Adrian keep searching? Or does Claire deserve to stay hidden? What would you do if you were Claire? Would you give him another chance? Or is love, once broken, beyond repair? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because stories like these deserve to be heard. See you in the next one.